Royal weddings are often shown as the ultimate fantasy, a kingdom celebrating, bells ringing, a perfect union of love and destiny. But the truth history hides is far darker. Behind those jeweled crowns and silk veils were girls forced into marriages they never wanted, brides who wept behind closed doors, and kings who used weddings as weapons of control. These were not tales of love, they were transactions wrapped in ceremony. In the 17th century, one of the most chilling royal wedding rituals took place in Russia. It was called the bride show. When Tsar Michael Romanov needed a wife, royal officials sent word across the land, demanding hundreds of young virgins to be brought to Moscow. More than 500 girls, most of them teenagers, were forced to line up in front of royal advisors like cattle at a market. They were inspected for beauty, obedience, family background, all while terrified parents watched their daughters chosen or rejected by strangers. The girl the Tsar finally chose was Maria Ivanovna Cleopatra, a modest noblewoman known for her purity. For a brief moment, she was lifted from obscurity to become Serena, the most powerful woman in Russia. But her joy did not last. Whispers began spreading in the court that Maria was barren, unfit to bear heirs. In truth, she had fallen ill after being poisoned by rivals who wanted another family to take her place. Tsar, pressured by his powerful mother and courtiers, was forced to send his new bride away. Maria was stripped of her title and exiled to Siberia. Her wedding, meant to symbolize divine favor, became a death sentence for her future. Stories like Maria's were not rare. Across kingdoms, brides were chosen for politics, not love. They were tools to secure peace, seal alliances, or strengthen bloodlines. A wedding could make a dynasty or destroy one. Behind every shining crown was a trail of broken hearts and silent suffering. The truth is, in royal history, marriage was never about affection. It was about control, lineage, and survival. The bride's beauty was currency. Her womb was a political weapon, and her will did not matter. But this was only the beginning. Because in the next story, we move from ancient palaces to modern times, to a kingdom where a teenage girl was abducted by royal guards and forced to marry her king. In royal history, forced marriages often sound like ancient horrors, things buried in the past. But one of the most disturbing royal weddings happened in our own century. It began in Eswatini, a small African kingdom once known as Swaziland. And the bride was not a noblewoman or a princess. She was just an 18-year-old schoolgirl named Zina Malanju. Zina lived an ordinary life until October 2002, when everything changed. According to witnesses, two men arrived at her school claiming to be agents of King Mswati III, one of the world's last absolute monarchs. Without warning, they took her away. Her mother was frantic. She called the police, reported her daughter missing, but was told to stop because Zina had been chosen. In Eswatini, the king holds an annual event called Umhlanga, or the reed dance, where thousands of young women perform before the monarch. It is a traditional ceremony, but it has also been criticized for allowing the king to select new brides. That year, Zina caught his attention. She didn't return home after the festival. Instead, she was taken to a royal compound to be prepared as one of his wives. Her mother fought desperately. She went to court, filed a case demanding her daughter's release. But the government stood by the king. The court refused to interfere. Human rights groups condemned the act, calling it abduction, slavery, and abuse of power. But in a country ruled by an absolute monarch, the law bent to the throne. Eventually, Zina became one of King Mswati's official wives. The wedding was held behind palace walls, with no public consent, no freedom of choice. The young girl who once dreamed of finishing school now lived under heavy guard, her voice silenced by fear. The royal family called it a sacred union. The world called it a kidnapping in royal disguise. For Zina, the ceremony wasn't a celebration, it was a surrender. She became a symbol of how power can twist love and tradition into something monstrous. Her story still echoes today, a reminder that not all royal weddings end in fairy tales. But if Zina's wedding was disturbing because of her lack of choice, others were equally horrifying for what they represented. Marriages used not for love, but for political manipulation. Queen's wedding set off a chain of betrayal, scandal, and near war, all in the name of royal control. By the mid-1800s, royal weddings had become more than family celebrations. They were chess moves in global politics. Nowhere was that clearer than in Spain, where a young queen named Isabella II found her life turned into a political battlefield. Her wedding was not just about vows and blessings. It was about power, betrayal, and manipulation by the world's greatest empires. In 1846, Queen Isabella II was only 16. She had barely learned what love meant when her government, pressured by foreign powers, demanded that she marry. To the public, the announcement was grand. The young queen would unite her nation through a glorious royal wedding. But behind the velvet curtains of Madrid's palace, two European giants, France and Britain, were fighting over who would control Spain's future through her marriage. Britain wanted Isabella to marry a prince aligned with its interests. France, under King Louis-Philippe, had other plans. In a desperate bid to secure influence, France pushed Isabella to marry her cousin, Francisco de Assis, a man whispered to be frail, distant, and unsuited for the throne. On the very same day, Isabella's younger sister, Infanta Luisa Fernanda, was married to Louis Philippe's son, a calculated double wedding that stunned Europe. Looked like a royal celebration. To those who knew the truth, it was a scandal. Isabella's marriage was not about affection. It was a diplomatic trap. The bride wept through her wedding preparations, knowing she was being used as a pawn in a game of empires. Even her own husband was rumored to prefer the company of men, making their union a political illusion rather than a romantic bond. The aftershock of this marriage was enormous. Britain felt betrayed and humiliated, claiming that France had violated previous agreements. The Spanish court fractured into factions, and Isabella herself sank into misery. The queen, who was supposed to rule with strength, became trapped in a marriage built on deceit. The wedding had achieved its purpose. It protected France's interests, but it destroyed the life of a teenage queen. Her husband, uninterested and cold, left her emotionally isolated. Her court became a nest of rumors, intrigue, and conspiracies. Her reign would later collapse under the same web of lies that began on her wedding day. Royal weddings were supposed to unite nations, yet, in Isabella's case, it tore one apart. Her crown came at the cost of her heart. But not all royal weddings were built on control and political deceit. Some were born from real love, yet ended in heartbreak and exile. In the next part, we'll uncover the story of a king who gave up everything for love. A wedding that shook the very foundation of the British Empire. In 1936, the British Empire witnessed a wedding so scandalous it nearly tore the monarchy apart. It wasn't arranged by diplomats or approved by Parliament. It was born from forbidden love. At its center stood King Edward VIII, a man who shocked the world by giving up his crown to marry Wallis Simpson, an American woman twice divorced. To some, it was a romantic legend. To others, it was treason against centuries of royal tradition. Edward had ascended the throne only months before the crisis began. The people adored him, handsome, modern, and outspoken. But behind his charm was a secret the palace tried desperately to hide. Edward was infatuated with Wallis, a socialite who captivated him with her wit and strength. Yet Wallis was already married, and even after her divorce, the Church of England, led by the king himself, forbade a monarch from marrying a divorced woman whose former husband was still alive. What followed was the most dramatic confrontation between love and duty in royal history. Advisors begged Edward to end the relationship. Prime ministers warned him that marrying Wallis would break the empire. Even his own mother turned away in shame. But Edward refused to surrender. "I have found the woman I love," he declared. "I cannot carry on the heavy burden of responsibility without her." His words stunned the world. On December 10th, 1936, Edward VIII signed the papers that changed history. He abdicated the throne, becoming the first British monarch to willingly step down in centuries. His brother, George VI, would take his place, and Edward would become known simply as the Duke of Windsor. 6 months later, on June 3, 1937, Edward married Wallis Simpson in a quiet ceremony in France. There were no royal guests, no palace bells, and no cheering crowds, only a few witnesses and a haunting silence that spoke louder than any celebration. The man who had once ruled over millions now lived in exile, trading power for love. Yet their marriage, though passionate at first, was marked by loneliness and suspicion. Many in Britain saw Wallace as a manipulative outsider, a woman who had bewitched a king. Secret intelligence files later suggested the couple had ties to Nazi Germany, rumors that deepened their isolation. Still, Edward never expressed regret. For him, the crown was not worth the cost of losing Wallace. But their story exposed a painful truth. Even the most powerful men could be prisoners of their own hearts. Their wedding was not just a love story. It was a warning to future royals. In the world of crowns and empires, love could be the most dangerous rebellion of all. But the next royal wedding would make even Edward and Wallace look tame. A union so strange and unsettling that it blurred the line between faith, madness, and obsession. The marble halls of ancient Rome, where emperors were treated as gods, one ruler went further than any before him. He married a goddess, or at least that's what he wanted the world to believe. His name was Elagabalus, a teenage emperor whose reign became one of the most shocking episodes in imperial history. His wedding wasn't just disturbing, it was a symbol of madness, blasphemy, and absolute power unchecked. Elagabalus ascended to the throne in 218 CE, barely 14 years old. He was the high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, from whom he took his name. From the moment he became emperor, he began forcing Rome to abandon its traditional gods in favor of his foreign deity. But his obsession didn't stop at worship. He believed himself to be divine, the earthly embodiment of the sun god, destined to reshape Rome into his own holy kingdom. In a move that horrified both senators and citizens, Elagabalus ordered the sacred black meteorite, the symbol of his god, to be brought from Syria to Rome. He built a grand temple for it and declared that even Jupiter, Rome's chief deity, must now bow before his god. Then came his most infamous act, a marriage ceremony between himself and the goddess Vesta, or rather, her living representative, a Vestal virgin named Aquilia Severa. To the Romans, this was the ultimate sacrilege. Vestal virgins were sworn to 30 years of chastity under pain of death. Their purity symbolized the safety of Rome itself. Yet Elagabalus claimed that uniting himself, the male sun, with Severa, the female fire, would bring divine harmony to the empire. He didn't see it as a scandal, saw it as destiny. The wedding was a lavish ritual. Gold, incense, and dancers filled the temple. The emperor appeared in jeweled robes, declaring his bride a goddess and himself a living god. But to his people, it was blasphemy turned into spectacle. The Senate erupted in outrage, priests called it an abomination, and ordinary Romans whispered that the emperor had gone mad. The marriage didn't last long, but the damage was done. It marked the point where religion, lust, and insanity merged in one terrifying show of absolute power. Even after divorcing Severa, Elagabalus went on to take other wives and husbands, dressing as a woman and demanding to be called empress. By 222 CE, his own guards had enough. The emperor who had married a goddess was dragged from his palace, beaten to death, and thrown into the Tiber River, his body desecrated like the idols he had defied. But his strange wedding left behind a haunting legacy, that the divine crown, when worshipped too much, could destroy both its wearer and the world around him. The next royal marriage would be no less dark, one sealed not by love or religion, but by blood, ambition, and death. Not all royal weddings were about love or divinity. Some were crafted with blood and fear, disguised as celebrations of unity. In the late 16th century, one of history's most disturbing royal weddings took place in France. A union that began with music and blessings, but ended in a massacre so horrific it scarred Europe for centuries. It was the wedding of Marguerite de Valois, a Catholic princess, and Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince. The year was 1572, and France was torn apart by religious war. Catholics and Protestants, known as Huguenots, were slaughtering each other in the streets. To stop the bloodshed, Queen Catherine de' Medici, mother of Marguerite, proposed a daring plan, a marriage that would unite the two faiths. On paper, it looked like peace. In reality, it was a trap. The ceremony in Paris was magnificent. Bells rang, banners flew, and thousands filled the city in celebration. Protestants traveled from across France to witness the historic union. Marguerite looked radiant in white silk, and Henry smiled nervously beside her. The crowd cheered, but behind palace walls, the Queen Mother was already plotting something far darker. Just 6 days after the wedding, on the night of August 23, 1572, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois tolled again, not for joy, but for death. Under Catherine's orders, Catholic soldiers and mobs flooded the streets, armed with swords and torches. What followed became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Henry's Protestant guests were slaughtered as they slept. Blood ran through the streets of Paris, soaking the same stones that had echoed with wedding music only days before. Men, women, and children were dragged from their homes. Even noble families weren't spared. In one night, thousands were killed, and over the following weeks, the violence spread across France, claiming tens of thousands more. Henry himself barely survived. Forced to renounce his faith, he was imprisoned inside the Louvre, surrounded by the ghosts of his murdered friends. Marguerite, horrified by her mother's betrayal, hid Huguenots in her chambers, saving dozens of lives. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of peace, became a memory of terror. Years later, Henry escaped captivity and reclaimed his crown, becoming Henry IV of France. But the scars of that wedding never faded. He later said, "Paris is worth a mass," converting once more to Catholicism for the sake of his country. Yet the massacre tied forever his marriage to one of the darkest betrayals in royal history. That wedding proved that love and religion meant nothing in the face of power, and that sometimes vows made before God were really oaths signed in blood. But the next royal marriage would reach an even deeper level of horror, one where the bride was forced to wed her own family, and the church itself turned away in silence. In the world of kings and queens, purity was not just a matter of status, it was an obsession. For centuries, royal families believed that their bloodline was divine, a gift from the gods that must never be diluted by commoners. But in protecting that sacred blood, they created some of the most disturbing marriages. In history, weddings between brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, even fathers and daughters, nowhere was this practice more extreme than in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs claimed they were children of the sun god Ra, destined to rule as living gods on earth. To preserve their heavenly heritage, they married within their own families. The famous Cleopatra VII, for example, wed both of her younger brothers, first Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. Though these marriages were largely political, they were performed with full royal ceremony, the siblings exchanging vows in glittering temples as priests praised their divine union. Behind the gold and incense, however, these relationships often ended in betrayal and bloodshed. Cleopatra fought bitterly with Ptolemy XIII for power, conflict that led to civil war and his death by drowning in the Nile. Later, she ruled alone, using her charm and cunning to captivate Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, breaking the cycle of incest that had cursed her dynasty. But for centuries before her, Egypt's royal bloodline had decayed under generations of inbreeding, leading to madness, deformity, and paranoia. The pattern didn't end with the ancient world. In Europe's Habsburg dynasty, inbreeding became a grotesque tradition disguised as duty. For over 200 years, they married close cousins to keep their empire intact. By the 17th century, the results were horrifying. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was born with such severe deformities that he could barely chew his food or speak clearly. His jaw jutted forward grotesquely, a symptom of what historians now call the Habsburg jaw. Charles's family tree was more a circle than a lineage. His parents were uncle and niece, and his ancestry showed more overlap than diversity. He was sickly, childless, and mentally unstable, the tragic product of centuries of pure royal breeding. On his deathbed, he confessed that his life had been a curse, not a blessing. These disturbing unions were justified by one cruel idea, that royal blood was too precious to mix with anyone else's. But behind the palace walls, they created monsters of their own making, rulers who were both victims and symbols of a system obsessed with divine power. Yet even among these twisted marriages, one stood apart, a union so cursed that it didn't just destroy a dynasty, it changed the future of an entire empire. In 1894, the glittering palaces of Russia prepared for a royal wedding that seemed to promise a bright future. Tsar Nicholas II, heir to one of the most powerful thrones in the world, was to marry Princess Alix of Hesse, a shy German princess. Their union was meant to symbolize hope, stability, and the continuation of a dynasty that had ruled for more than 300 years, yet behind the gold, silk, and music. This wedding marked the beginning of the end, the first chapter in the tragic collapse of the Romanov Empire. The ceremony took place only weeks after Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, died suddenly. Mourning shrouded the empire, and instead of a joyous coronation, the wedding became a haunting mix of sorrow and celebration. Nicholas was heartbroken, but determined. "My dream is fulfilled," he wrote, "though I have lost my father." Princess Alex, who would take the Russian name Alexandra Fyodorovna, was deeply religious and fiercely devoted to her new husband. But she struggled to adapt to the Russian court. The nobles saw her as cold and foreign, and the people whispered that her pale eyes carried bad luck. Still, the couple's love was genuine, one of the few true romances in royal history. Yet fate had already set a darker path for them. Their first years were marked by political unrest and tragedy. The coronation itself, held 2 years later, turned into a disaster when a stampede during the festivities killed over 1,300 people. Some saw it as an omen, a curse on the new Tsar and his queen. As the empire trembled under poverty, strikes, and rebellion, Alexandra withdrew deeper into her faith, believing that God had chosen them to rule Russia. But the birth of their son, Alexei, revealed another cruel twist. He suffered from hemophilia, a deadly blood disorder inherited through Alexandra's family, the same disease that plagued European royals because of their intermarriage. Terrified that her son's illness would destroy the dynasty, Alexandra turned to a mysterious monk for help, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's influence over the royal family became one of the most disturbing scandals in modern monarchy. He was said to heal the boy through prayer, and in return, Alexandra allowed him deep access to the palace. Rumors spread that Rasputin controlled the empress, whispering advice that affected state decisions. To the people, their once beloved rulers now seemed cursed, corrupted, and blind. When revolution finally erupted in 1917, the Romanovs were imprisoned and later executed by Bolshevik soldiers. The bloodline that began in splendor ended in gunfire and silence. Their wedding, meant to unite love and power, had instead set the stage for tragedy. It wasn't just the end of 2 lives, but of an empire built on divine right and doomed by human weakness. But one final story remains, a royal wedding so grotesque, so steeped in death and vanity, that even centuries later, historians can hardly believe it happened. In the long and twisted record of royal unions, one story stands apart as the most macabre of all, a wedding where the bride was already dead. It sounds like a nightmare, but it truly happened. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte, the self-proclaimed Emperor of France, orchestrated one of the most shocking ceremonies in European history, the posthumous wedding of his loyal general to a woman who had already passed away. It was a real marriage between the living and the dead. The story began with Captain Jean-Nicolas Delaunay, soldier who fell in love with a young woman named Pauline Billard during the Napoleonic Wars. Their love was pure, but tragic. Before they could wed, Pauline was killed in a flood, her body discovered days later, her wedding dress already prepared but never worn. Delaunay was devastated. When he begged Napoleon for permission to honor her memory with a funeral, the emperor did something unthinkable. He granted him permission not just for a burial, but for a legal marriage to his dead fiancée. Under French law, Napoleon had the power to authorize posthumous marriages, a strange practice rooted in the idea that love, loyalty, and duty could outlive death itself. So, in a quiet chapel lit by candles, Delaunay stood beside Pauline's coffin. He wore his military uniform, she her wedding gown. The priest read the vows. Delaunay answered, trembling, "Oui." In that moment, he was officially married to a corpse. This eerie tradition didn't stop with him. Over the years, several such ceremonies took place under Napoleon's rule, usually when a soldier's beloved died before their wedding day. To some, it was an act of mercy, a way to honor promises cut short by war. But to others, it was grotesque, a union that blurred the line between devotion and delusion. Even more chilling was the wedding's aftermath. Legally, Pauline was recorded as Delaunay's wife. Her family received the benefits of a soldier's widow, and Delaunay spent the rest of his life visiting her grave every year on their anniversary. He never remarried. In letters preserved from that time, he wrote, "Death may have taken her hand, but not her heart." Historians still debate Napoleon's motives. Some say he allowed such unions to inspire loyalty in his troops, proof that the empire rewarded even love beyond the grave. Others see it as another example of the emperor's obsession with control, even over death itself. The wedding of the dead remains one of the darkest chapters in royal and imperial history, a haunting symbol of power, passion, and madness. It showed that in the world of rulers and empires, even love could be twisted into ceremony, and even the dead could be forced to obey the will of a crown. Because in royal history, weddings were rarely about love. They were about power, possession, and the illusion of control, even over the grave itself.